Hello, I'm Frank Uciardo. Thank you for joining us here in New York City. You're watching Arise News Now, your fast forward to stories that affect you, making headlines around the world in this hour. The New York grand jury decides not to indict the police officer in the chokehold death of a Staten Island man. We'll have the latest. California's drought problem may be over, but now they could be in store for mudslides. And more explosive allegations are lodged against comedian Bill Cosby. Those stories and much more straight ahead. Our top story is news out of Staten Island, New York, where a grand jury decided not to indict a white police officer who allegedly choked an unarmed black man to death. The incident happened back in July when police officer Daniel Pantaleo appears in this video to use a chokehold when arresting Eric Garner. The medical examiner's office ruled Garner's death a homicide. The grand jury had considered various charges from murder to reckless endangerment and after deliberating came back with no indictment. After the grand jury decision came down, police officer Daniel Pantaleo made the following statement, quote, "I became a police officer to help people and to protect those who can't protect themselves. It is never my intention to harm anyone, and I feel very bad about the death of Mr. Garner. My family and I include him and his family in our prayers, and I hope that they will accept my personal condolences for their loss," unquote. News of the decision traveled quickly, prompting U.S. President Obama to weigh in on the decision.
It is incumbent upon all of us as Americans, regardless of race, region, faith, that we recognize this is an American problem and not just a black problem or a brown problem or a Native American problem. This is an American problem. When anybody in this country is not being treated equally under the law, that's a problem. And it's my job as president to help solve it.
Joining me now to discuss the grand jury's decision is former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Randy Zelin. Randy, you know, after watching the video and hearing Eric Garner say, "I can't breathe," how does it happen that this police officer can go in front of a grand jury and convince them not to indict him?
It's very difficult to play Monday morning quarterback, particularly when you have the secrecy surrounding a grand jury proceeding where we really don't know what evidence was presented by the prosecutor. But having said that, yes, that evokes an emotional reaction, but that does not necessarily equate to a homicide. And invariably what happened was the grand jury was left to decide whether or not it was more likely than not. Probable cause. Very close. But was there sufficient evidence to show that this particular officer either intended to cause the death of Mr. Garner or closed his eyes to the high probability that he would cause the death of Mr. Garner? But there is an issue of an intent, and there's the issue of the foreseeability of what he did. And they found that he did not have murder, death on his mind.
Now, you yourself have been on both sides of the legal fence here. Put yourself in the hands of that prosecutor. Would you have had a very difficult time making that grand jury indict this police officer?
That is an amazing question because we have seen lately, Ferguson and now here, how the whole concept of the grand jury has changed. Historically, even though the grand jury is supposed to be a check on the prosecution, ordinary citizens making sure there's sufficient evidence, historically, it's been rubber stamped. Chief Judge Wackler once said grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. It's not an adversarial proceeding. But suddenly we now find prosecutors almost bending over backwards to make it fair to a defendant. Maybe people would argue too fair. And let's go back to the days of just give them what they need so they can indict and worry about whether or not you can prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt at another point in time.
Now, do you believe that police officers and prosecutors in this case have some kind of, influence as far as race, a race, angle to what's going on with the grand jury? Is it possible that they ignored even bringing that up before the grand jury?
One can only hope and pray that race was not a factor at any level, whether it be the facts, whether it be the evidence, whether the way the case was presented. But of course, that is ignoring the 800-pound elephant in the room. Did race play a role here? We can only guess that witnesses came in and either were not consistent on what happened or were entirely consistent on what happened. The issue of Mr. Garner's physical health clearly played a factor, whether asthma was a factor in his death, his weight was a factor in his death, heart disease, none of which could have been anticipated by the officer.
Randy Zone, thank you for joining us here on Arise News.
Thank you.
And turning now to the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, where tensions surrounding the non-indictment of former police officer Darren Wilson in the death of Michael Brown are still visible. Michael Brown's stepfather, Lewis Head, is reportedly under investigation for inciting a riot. Head has apologized after his emotional outburst to demonstrators after the grand jury decision in that case was handed down. Lewis Head could be heard yelling, "Burn the city down." Rioting and looting soon followed. Law enforcement sources told CNN he is unlikely to be prosecuted.